Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this English lesson where we're going to talk about the yard. I'm not going to say what the yard is, but it has something to do with the outdoors, and if you live in a house. But we're going to talk about things you can do in the yard, things you would use in the yard, and just a whole English lesson about the yard. When you talk about the yard, you're talking about the area outside of a house. If you live in an apartment, you don't have a yard. Usually you have a balcony, but you don't have a yard. If, however, you live in a house, you will have a yard. Usually you will have a front yard. This is the yard in front of your house. So the area from the street to your house would be called your yard. In North America, most houses have a yard. Some have small yards, some have really big yards, but it's fairly normal for a house to have a yard. I should say that this lesson, again, is very North American. This is very much a Canadian and American style lesson. I'm going to be talking about things that are common in yards in Canada and in the United States. It's probably somewhat related to other English-speaking countries, but because I am Canadian, this will definitely be very much a North American lesson. So, from the front of your house to the road or street, we would call that your front yard. Usually your front yard, if you look at this one, has some sort of sidewalk or path leading to the front door, but definitely you would have a front yard. Behind your house, you will probably have a backyard. A backyard is usually a fairly private area. Sometimes it's surrounded by a fence or hedge, which I'll talk about later. A backyard usually is covered in lawn or grass. They're kind of the same thing. I'll explain more in a bit. But a backyard is a place that you can use in the warmer times of the year just to enjoy yourself outside. You might sit out in the backyard to read a book. You might do other activities in the backyard. But it's usually the area from your house to what we call the property line. When you buy a house in Canada or the United States, the edges of your place are called the property line. So your backyard would go from your house to your property line. And then you might have a neighbor across the fence. You might also have what's called a side yard. In order to talk about the areas on each side of your house, you might use the term side yard. So in the side yard, you might have a few things like flower beds or other things. Some people don't have a side yard or don't have a very big side yard. Sometimes the houses are so close together, there's not enough room for you to have a side yard. But sometimes if you live in a house on a corner, you might have a front yard, a side yard, and a backyard. That's kind of cool. Notice something interesting about these three words. Front yard is 2 words. Backyard is 1 word, and side yard is 2 words. I don't know why. That's just the way English is. As I mentioned before, your yard will most likely be made up of lawn. So lawn is simply another word for grass. So in the backyard or front yard, you will probably have a really nice lawn. You might have things like squirrels that run around in your lawn. Some people aren't very happy about that, but it's just one of the things that happens when you live in North America. And again, a lawn is made up of grass. So you grow grass in order to have a lawn. Grass can come from grass seed, or there's something called sod, where you buy a roll of grass and you roll it out and then you water it and it grows. I should have made a slide for that, but I forgot to. Sorry about that. When you have a lawn, you need to mow it. Okay, so quite often on Saturdays, you will hear people mowing their lawn. People will say things like, oh, I need to mow my lawn today. It's time to mow my lawn. Or they'll say, it hasn't rained for weeks and I don't need to mow my lawn right now because it isn't growing. But definitely, if you have a lawn, you need to mow your lawn. And what do you use to mow your lawn? You would use a lawnmower. A lawnmower is a device with a motor that you push around and it mows your lawn. It cuts it off at a certain height. People in North America, some people in North America are very particular about their lawns. They want their lawns to look perfect. So they will often mow their lawn, even if it hasn't grown very much. They just like to keep it really, really neat and really, really tidy. I am not one of those people. I have far too large of a property to worry about that. We're just happy if we get the lawn mowed every week. That's enough for us to be happy. You might use a push mower. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you. So a push mower obviously is called a push mower because you push it, okay? You pull it to start it. It's a pull start motor, and then you push it in order to mow the lawn. If you are someone who has a large lawn, you will most likely, though, have a riding mower. We also call this a lawn tractor or a garden tractor, but a riding mower is a little nicer because you can sit on it and you just drive around while you mow your lawn. We mow the vast majority of our lawn with a riding mower because we live on a farm. It's just far too much lawn to mow with a push mower. We do have a push mower, but for the most part, we use the riding mower to mow our lawn. Let's see here. And then we have something called a weed eater. So a weed eater is a machine that you can use to trim the lawn along your fence or along areas where it's hard to get to with a push mower or riding mower. So people will often weed eat around trees, or they'll weed eat along the fence. Some people call it a whippersnipper. I usually call it a weed eater, but it's a machine with a string and it spins super fast. And then you can go along and you can trim or you can weed eat around things. I'm just curious what Brent from American English would call a weed eater, whether he calls it a whippersnipper or a weed eater. There's a few names for this garden tool in English. We call it a weed eater because it eats weeds, I guess. It doesn't actually eat them, but it certainly does cut them down. As I mentioned, some people like to keep their lawn looking immaculate. When you keep something immaculate, it's perfect. They like their lawn to be in perfect condition. So they will mow their lawn every week. They will fertilize their lawn 2 or 3 times a year. Fertilizer is something that you put on plants to help them grow. It's like a bag filled with nutrients, we would call it. It has nitrogen and phosphate and potassium, I think are the 3. So many people who enjoy having a lush green lawn will fertilize their lawn in the spring and fall, and maybe even in the summer. They might get a little carried away and fertilize a little too much. I don't fertilize my lawn. I have no reason to fertilize my lawn. It grows well enough without fertilizer, so I do not do that. So in your yard, you might have what are called flower beds. So between your lawn and your house, you might have an area where you just have soil, and in that area, you might grow different plants. You might have flowering plants. You might have other plants that don't flower, but you might have an area around your house. You can kind of see it here where you have various plants that you grow just so that you have kind of like a wild area. We don't usually have the lawn come right up to the house. We usually have an area where we have a few flower beds. As someone mentioned earlier, most backyards in North America will have a fence. People will build a fence around the yard. They will build the fence to have some privacy. In fact, sorry, I'm just a little itchy there. I know that's kind of weird, but in fact, we have a certain kind of fence called a privacy fence. If you build a fence and it's higher than most people's eyes, if it's higher than that, we would call it a privacy fence. So if it's a fence you can't see through and it's about my height, we would call it a privacy fence. But most backyards, again, will have a fence at some point. Eventually, almost everyone builds a fence in their backyard. If you are really good friends with your neighbors, the people who live beside you, you might put a gate in your fence so that you can go between your yards. But it really depends on whether you like your neighbors or if you don't like your neighbors. If you don't like your neighbors, you probably don't have a gate in your fence. Many people in their backyard will have a shed or a garden shed. You can use both terms. You could keep all of your tools, all of your gardening tools in your garden shed. You could call it a backyard shed. You can just call it a shed. But a shed is a small building that you have usually in your backyard where you just keep some things that you don't want to keep in your house. You might keep your lawnmower in your shed. You might keep your shovel and your rake in your shed. I'll talk about those in a little bit. But many, many people will have a garden shed. In fact, when people buy a house, they usually build a fence and then they usually build a garden shed. Those are two very popular things to have in your yard once you buy a house. Some people, but not everyone, will have a garden or what we would call a vegetable garden. Not very many people have vegetable gardens anymore. Many people will have flower beds, like I mentioned earlier. Around the front of their house, they'll have flower beds, or we just call them beds. You know, I'm going to plant this in the bed on the side of the house. But some people still have a large garden. My grandfather, on my father's side of the family, had a large vegetable garden at his house. I remember when we visited when I was a child, he grew so much food. We got lots of beans from him. We got lots of lettuce from him. We got a lot of vegetables from my grandfather. Again, my grandfather on my father's side. I'm not sure if you're aware of how that works. So when you talk about your grandparents, you refer to your grandparents on your mother's side or your grandparents on your father's side. That's how you indicate which set of grandparents you're talking about. So my grandfather on my father's side had a large vegetable garden. Instead of a fence, you might have a hedge around your yard. So a hedge is basically the same as a fence, but it's made out of plants. So you can see here, they have grown plants, and those plants act as a barrier between, in this case, the road and the person's yard. So instead of a fence, you might actually plant a hedge. Sometimes we call it a hedgerow. It takes a few years to grow, but at a certain point, you will have a living fence. That might be a nice way to say it. You will have a fence that's made out of plants. Let me just check. I'm going to talk about a hedge trimmer a little bit later because you do have to trim a hedge if you have a hedge. If you have children, there are a few things you will probably have in your yard because you have children, or maybe if you have grandchildren. One of the things you might have is a sandbox. So a sandbox is something that's made out of wood, and people actually go and buy sand and they fill it with sand. The sand is similar to the sand that you would have at the beach. It's a very fine sand, and it's just an area for children to play, usually for really, really young children. So really young children sometimes will have a sandbox in their backyard, and they'll play in the sandbox with the same toys you would use at the beach. They usually have a little shovel, and they have a pail. You can see the pail way over there. And then they will have just toys that they use in their sandbox. So many families with young children will build a sandbox in their backyard and fill it with sand so that the children can play in it. We had a sandbox when our kids were younger. It's kind of in disrepair now. I should probably take it apart because it doesn't look very good. I'll show you in a video sometime our sandbox. If you're lucky and you have a really big tree and your parents are industrious people, they might build you a treehouse. My kids never had a treehouse. We have lots of large trees, but I never built a treehouse for our kids. But a treehouse is a small house built in a tree. So up off the ground, you build a little tiny house. It's more like a shed, but we do call it a treehouse. And it's for kids to play in. So if you have large trees, and if your mom or dad takes the time, you might have a treehouse as a kid. That would be really fun. I feel bad that I never built a treehouse for my kids, but I know we have lots of trees, but we don't have a lot of really, really big trees on our property. I don't know if you've noticed that in the videos. You might also have a playhouse. I don't have a slide for this. A playhouse is similar to a shed, but it's designed for kids to play in. It might be like a really small house in the backyard. You might have a small playhouse. And you might have what's called a swing. A swing is something that you hang from a large tree, and you can sit on it and you can swing back and forth. Sometimes you will have someone push you on the swing. When we took our kids to the playground when they were young, they would go on the swing, and then Jen or I would push them on the swing, and they would have a fun time swinging. You might have what's called a swing set. Let me make this a bit bigger. So this is a swing. It hangs from a tree, but you might also have a swing set. A swing set is something that parents can buy that kids can go on. You'll often see swing sets at the park. If you go to the park, they'll have really, really big swing sets. But a swing set is similar to a swing. It's something that children can sit on, and then they can swing back and forth, and they could just enjoy themselves outside. Some tools. Let's do a few tools, and then I will get to some questions. I think I can make these big. A shovel is something that a lot of people have. If they need to dig a hole somewhere in their yard, or if they just need to move some sand or some soil, they will have a shovel. There are many different kinds of shovels. We have this kind of shovel. I think you saw it in the thumbnail. You might have a rake. This rake in particular is used quite often to rake leaves. Often in the fall, people living in the city, if they own a house, will need to go outside and rake leaves in Canada. There are a lot of leaves on the ground in the fall, and someone needs to rake them up. So notice something interesting here. You can shovel with a shovel. So it's a noun and a verb, right? I need to go shovel some dirt. I need to shovel some dirt. I need to use a shovel to shovel some dirt. I just banged my microphone. When you use a rake, you rake things. So you would rake leaves with a rake. Very often in English, we make verbs out of nouns. So that's a case where we do that as well. A hedge trimmer is used to trim a hedge. I think we looked at the hedge a few slides ago. When you have a hedge, which is a living barrier, just let me have a drink here for a sec, which is a living barrier, you need to trim it sometimes once or twice a year, and you would use a hedge trimmer. So you would trim the hedge with a trimmer, a hedge trimmer. This is an electric one, so this one probably runs off batteries. If I was needing to trim a hedge, I would want to use one that ran off batteries. I wouldn't want to use one that was hand powered. Let me get to the next one. Pruners. If you have small trees or maybe some fruit trees in your backyard, or if you have flowers that you like to cut to make bouquets, you would have pruners. So if you needed to go cut a few flowers, you would use pruners. And it always has an S on the end. It's like scissors. So you would say, where are the pruners? I need to get a pair of pruners. So it works the same as scissors. Hopefully that made some sense. And then you probably will have a watering can if you need to water some plants in your backyard. Maybe you have flower beds and you need to bring water because the plants need to be watered. You would use a watering can to water the plants. Notice I'm trying to use the words and give you example sentences. So you would say, the plants in the flower bed in the side yard need water. I'm going to get the watering can and go water them. Okay, so you're getting some good examples, hopefully, of the sentences you could use. You might also have a hose or a garden hose. We use both terms. A garden hose is a small hose that you can hook up to a tap, and then you can turn the tap on and water comes out the other end. You could hook the garden hose up to a sprinkler if you wanted to water your lawn. So let me back up here. Oh, wait, no, I have two more. You might also have gardening gloves. Maybe you don't want to get sore hands when you're working in the flower beds or the garden. So you might have gloves that you wear. Generally, gardening gloves, these look worn out. These are well-worn gardening gloves. But you probably would put gardening gloves on if you were to work in the garden, just so your hands don't get sore or worn. And then you will most likely have a wheelbarrow. A wheelbarrow is a one-wheeled machine that you can use to move things easily around your yard. Shrubs. So I mentioned flower beds. You might grow flowers in your flower beds. You might grow other things like shrubs in your flower beds. Shrubs are like really small trees, and they don't grow very big, or you might trim them with a hedge trimmer. But this would be a classic example of what shrubs look like. They are very, very small woody plants that you would grow in your flower beds. You might also grow perennials in your flower beds. Perennials are a type of flower that grows every year and flowers every year. So in places like where I live, in the summer, they would just grow and bloom. In the winter, they would be under the snow, and the next year they would just grow again. That's different than annuals. Annuals are flowering plants that you need to start from seed every year. So let me repeat, perennials just come back every year. You don't have to do anything, and they just bloom and they're beautiful. Annuals, you need to actually start from seed every year in your flower bed, and then they will grow. Most yards, front yards and side yards, will have some sort of walkway or path, okay? We wouldn't call it a sidewalk, okay? I know it seems like it looks a bit like a sidewalk. We wouldn't call it a sidewalk, but you would have a walkway or a path or a pathway that leads maybe through your backyard to your garden shed. Maybe it leads from your house to the sidewalk in front of your house, but you will most likely have some kind of walkway. You will probably have a bench somewhere. Some of you know that if you watch my other YouTube channel, a lot of times I'm sitting on my bench teaching a short English lesson. So many people will have a bench in their yard. You can call it a garden bench. You can just call it a bench. If it was in a park, you would call it a park bench. But if it's in your yard, you would just call it a bench or a garden bench. Annette says, it's difficult to pronounce perennial. Yeah, let's go back. Perennial. So we grow a lot of perennials. We have many perennials. There you go. And then we have a lot of annuals as well. Hopefully that helped, Annette. Let me see. I got to see where I am here in the lesson. Some people will have a small pond in their backyard, and you might call it a fish pond. You might just call it a pond. So they will actually use a shovel to dig a hole in the ground, and they will create a place that they can fill with water, and then they will put some fish in it, usually goldfish. That is one of the most popular types of fish. And they will dig the pond deep enough so that it doesn't freeze in the winter, and then the goldfish can live there year round. So I don't have a pond in my backyard. Some people, if they really like something like that, they will build a pond. I'm having trouble talking. I don't know why. Some people dry their clothes after they wash their clothes in the washing machine. They will have a machine called a dryer. So they will wash their clothes in the washing machine, and then they will throw the clothes in the dryer, and then they will dry their clothes. Some people have a clothesline. Let me repeat that so you can hear the pronunciation. A clothesline. A clothesline is a long cable outside, or a long piece of wire or rope that you hang clothes on with clothespins. Those little wooden things there are called clothespins, so that your clothes can dry outside. So you would wash your clothes in a washing machine, and then you would hang your clothes on the clothesline to dry. We don't use a clothesline. We actually have what are called drying racks. So we wash our clothes, we hang them on the drying rack, and then we put them outside. That's how we dry our clothes. Some people might have a pool. We don't have a pool, but as was mentioned earlier in the lesson, pools were a very popular thing to build this past year. Many people built a pool in their backyard because we weren't able to go anywhere for the last 10 months, and the summer was really, really hot. So some people might have a pool in their backyard. Rod says he's taken 2 weeks off as well. That's a good plan, Rod. When I take 2 weeks off, though, I just work a little bit less. I don't stop working completely. So I'm still going to put out about 5 videos, but we'll see how that goes. If you have little children, really, really small children, you might have a kiddie pool. A kiddie pool is a very, very tiny pool that you just fill up, and then kids can play in it and enjoy cooling off a little bit on a hot summer day. If you have a dog, you will most likely have a doghouse in your backyard. Oscar has a doghouse, but he never uses it. So a doghouse is a small house that you build for your dog so that your dog has a place just to sit in the summer if it gets hot and to just be outside. So if you have a dog, you will most likely have a doghouse outside. I always think it's funny because I built Oscar a really nice doghouse. It's actually an insulated doghouse, so it's even warm in the winter, and he never uses it. He doesn't really like it. He likes being in the real house with us. He doesn't like being in the doghouse. Let's see here. You might have a patio. So again, there's a slight difference between a deck and a patio. A patio is at ground level, and it's usually made out of flat stones or concrete. Okay, so a patio is usually outside a house between the door of the house and the lawn. You might have a patio. You might have patio furniture. So the chairs and table here, we would call that patio furniture. And it's just a nice place to sit outside in the summer. Many homes in Canada have a patio, or they might have a deck. A deck is usually made out of wood, and it's usually raised off the ground. So a deck is usually a little bit higher than the lawn, and it's usually made out of wood. So those are the two differences. I think an equal amount of houses in North America have either a patio or a deck. And then on the deck, many people will have a barbecue, just a nice place where they can cook some things, where they can barbecue in the summer and just enjoy being outside. I think I'm almost done, actually. That surprised me. Time flies when you're having fun. You might, in your backyard, have a picnic table. Many of you have seen my picnic table. It's quite old. I think I should build a new one because the picnic table it's starting to fall apart a little bit. It's been many, many years. I think it might be time to build a new picnic table. But many people in their backyard, they will have a picnic table so that they can go and sit and eat outside. And then many people will have lawn chairs. A lawn chair is a foldable chair that's easy to take with you when you go places. When we visit family in the summer, we take our lawn chairs because we often sit in the backyard. So it's very common to just have lawn chairs. In our family, Jen and I and all the kids, we each have a lawn chair. So when we go to visit Jen's sister, we will put all the lawn chairs in the van. When we get there, we will take our lawn chairs out and we will open them up and we will sit in the backyard on our lawn chair. When we're done visiting, we'll fold up our lawn chair and we'll go home again. So a lawn chair is a very common type of chair to have. And there's many kinds of lawn chairs. And then you might have a birdhouse. This birdhouse is a little bit covered in snow, but in your backyard, if you are someone who enjoys wildlife, and in particular, if you really like birds, you might have a birdhouse. A birdhouse, again, is a small house, usually with a hole in it. And the hole is usually the right size for a certain kind of bird. And then you might have birds. I didn't make a slide for bird feeder. You might also have a bird feeder in your backyard that birds can come and they can eat bird food. Bird food? Bird. That's weird. Hey, Jen. What do you call bird feed? Bird seed? What do you call it? Yeah, I'm not an expert, so I had to ask Jen. If you have a bird feeder, I think you put bird seed in it, but I should check that one. Maybe look it up. I'm obviously not a bird feeder expert, but you might have a small bird feeder that you hang from a tree, and you might fill it with bird feed or bird seed. Check that one because I'm not 100% sure.